set it up and it's gone by. But we'll just give another 5 minutes so that some people said they were coming. We haven't quite arrived yet. So we'll give you another 5 minutes. But just to let you know, you are live on YouTube.
Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Can you hear me on the live?
Thank you very much.
Let me take my. I'm not following the person that is out and I introduced him. Came with a piece of paper and he stood, give a British lecture, but I could see from behind that there's nothing on it.
But this is the thing we spoke.
Well, I'm not so confident.
Anyway, let's leave. Shall we leave that there?
Is it on?
It's on. I think it's on. I think mine's on as well. And a good time. I think so. Exactly. Because I think that's a much better Well, good evening, folks. My name is John Alderdice. I'm the president of the National Liberal Club here and the honorary president of Liberal International. And I'm absolutely delighted that this evening we've got John with us, John Gray. I'm going to say a little bit more about him a little bit later on. I don't need to say anything to introduce him because the reason you're all here is because you already know very much and respect and are excited by the things he says and writes. But what I do want to do is start off by inviting the president of Liberal International, a global organization of more than 100 political parties around the world, Professor Karl-Heinz Packe, to come and kick off our session. Karl-Heinz is the president of Liberal International. He's also the president of Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, the German liberal political foundation, a very old friend, an academic himself. Karl-Heinz, you have the floor.
Thank you, dear John. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have you here in this wonderful environment. For me, it's always, when I travel to London to the National Liberal Club, this is a very special occasion because you feel and smell, if you like, intellectually, the liberalism of the 19th century in this great country. And I'm extremely happy that tonight John Gray will give the Isaiah Berlin lecture and the discussion together with John Alderdice. I haven't seen him yet, but I wanted to welcome also Timothy Cotton Ash. He will be here tonight, but he hasn't arrived yet, and he was giving the lecture last year. So it's an annual event, and we are really happy to have such great personalities talking about the topic of freedom, liberty, and tonight populism, liberalism, populism, and the sense of reality. Ladies and gentlemen, for us in Liberal International, this global organization of roughly 110 liberal parties and citizen groups in the world, for us, life is not easy these days because things happen in the world which go completely against our philosophy. On the one side, you have populist movements all over the place. On the other side, you have the rise of autocracy in many countries. And, I'm 69 years old. I grew up in the spirit of ever greater progress in the direction of freedom, of liberty, of democracy, in the spirit of the 1990s, when Francis Fukuyama forecasted or predicted the end of history, the complete victory of democracy and freedom and the values our society stands for. He was wrong. He admits today that he was wrong more than that. We were all wrong. We were all too optimistic. Liberals, by their very nature, their genes, I think, have to be optimistic, and they are optimistic. And we were optimistic at the time, but things have turned out much more difficult in the last few years. And I travel around a lot in the world. I was in Turkey very recently. I don't have to go into the details about the government of Erdogan in Turkey, and I was in the Czech Republic in Prague at the Forum 2000, which was established by Václav Havel, one of these great men who tore down the Iron Curtain in the late 1980s and early 90s. And even there, we had elections recently, and new populist parties are popping up and completely changing the political landscape. Now I stop here because we will discuss all these matters and the deeper roots and the deeper reasons for these fundamental shifts and changes in our societies afterwards. And note, please, they happen in all our societies. I'm a German. We thought for a long time that populism was a matter that popped up in France, in Britain, in the surrounding countries. But now the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, scores in the polls at 25%, and in the last federal election in February, they got 20%. So you see populism everywhere, and let's try tonight to get a bit deeper into the matter together with the two Johns sitting in front of us. I am looking forward to having a great evening with you tonight, and please, the floor is yours, the two Johns. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Karl-Heinz. And indeed, we're all looking forward to this evening. I have to tell you why I'm particularly looking forward to it. I'm not going to introduce John because, as I said earlier, there isn't any point. It's just a waste of time. You're all here because you already know John. You've read lots of his books and his regular papers and columns and so on, and that's why you're here. So I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to just say one or two words about why I wanted him to be here to give the Liberal International Isaiah Berlin lecture, an annual lecture that we run, and wanted to do it this year. I have here a couple of John's books, because they sort of express the two strands that inspired me. The first one comes from my experience in Northern Ireland. And I see Mick Cox is here, and it's very good to see him and Fiona. Mick, professor at LSE, but spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland. And one of the challenges that we had was to come to understand that the different sides of the community, and there are at least two and arguably more than two, had views that were really fundamentally different. And there was no point, I discovered after a while, hoping that they were all going to come around to the same perspective. Our job was not to find a way of getting everyone to agree, but to find a way of disagreeing without killing each other. And so when I then later came to read a lot more about Isaiah Berlin, and particularly to read John's book about Isaiah Berlin, and John knew Isaiah Berlin, worked with him in Oxford. What he clarified for me was that one of the really important things Isaiah Berlin said was not about two kinds of liberty and so on, the kinds of things that people read and talk a lot about, but what he called value pluralism, the understanding that people do fundamentally differ about things, and that there isn't some kind of right answer that applies to everybody all over the place. And how do you find a way of living with that? And that was the first reason why I began to be very interested in the things that John was saying, because he knew Berlin and he gave a different kind of understanding and emphasis to the important things from Berlin's work. The second's a much more recent book, and it's this one here, The New Leviathans. And the reason that was really interesting to me was because there was something going on in politics that was really affecting liberalism and liberal colleagues. Things were not going the way many had hoped they would go. And so a few of us got together in one of the colleges I work with in Oxford, Harris Manchester College, and spent a few days looking at some of these things, listening to interviews between yourself and Francis Fukuyama, and the conversation, very civilized conversation that you had, but demonstrating value pluralism in the sense you clearly we're not going to see things from the same perspective. But what it did do was raise for a number of liberal colleagues the need to face things in a different kind of way. That we'd come to a point where it wasn't going to be sufficient to just tweak things a little bit here and there, put in a new rider or a caveat. There were some really quite fundamental things going on. And I couldn't think of anyone better to help us understand that than John Gray, because in season and out of season, he's been warning us, telling us, advising us that these are the kinds of things that happen. And I'm absolutely delighted, John, that you agreed to come. It's an honor. It's a privilege. All of us feel that here, I know. So can I ask you to give John a very warm welcome as we look forward to what he has to say. John.
Well, thank you very much, John. I am the recipient of the honor and of the privilege and the pleasure to be talking to this distinguished audience in such a beautiful room, so redolent of the fragrance of an earlier age, which in some ways was not as advanced as ours, but in other ways perhaps might have been more advanced than we have since become. And I think John touched on two very important features of Isaiah Berlin's thought, which I absorbed from around 20 years of talking with him on a regular basis. And the first is that politics, and in particular liberal politics, is not the pursuit of agreement or of rational consensus. It's an attempt to reach a modus vivendi, that we can live with each other without killing each other, but even perhaps benefiting from each other and learning from each other and collaborating with each other, but without the idea of some kind of asymptotic point of convergence. In the future, we will remain different, divergent, with potentially or actually competing and rivalrous impulses and needs and views of the world. But the second is, which comes from John's own direct experience, which he modestly didn't mention, which is that some differences which appear to be completely intractable and have been for many generations can be moderated, not transcended or left behind in a dustbin of history, but rather become areas around which human beings can, with wise leadership, fortunate historical conditions, can live together even with those deep intractable differences. So the goal of putting aside all of our world perspectives, our worldviews, our faiths, our religions, and our histories, which a certain type of liberalism, which evolved, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years, but which has some roots in the longer stretches of liberal thought, in the history of liberal thought. That, I think, is one of the fundamental reasons, this idea that liberalism is incomplete or even failure if it doesn't produce a rational consensus. I think that's one of the reasons we've got into the mess we've got into. And that leads me to my, in a sense, first and perhaps for some of you rather challenging claim about liberalism and populism, which is that they're not in fact opposites. They're not in fact independent of each other. Populism is the shadow of a certain type of liberalism. Populism, which as John and others have mentioned, our distinguished chairman have mentioned, is not a local phenomenon in the English-speaking world. It's not just Trump. It's not just Le Pen. It's practically universal now. Has become a powerful, if not a governing, but a powerful force in the land of Jan Hus, Bohemia. Where could you have a more stronger historical embodiment of the pursuit of religious freedom? And in Japan, which seemed to be insulated from it by its relatively self-enclosed and highly cohesive society, but is so no longer. So it's all but universal. And there haven't been very many successful attempts to contain it, actually. Maybe a bit in Sweden or Denmark, one or two European countries, but mostly it's still on the rise. And that leads me to a comment. I mean, one of the things which, there's tragedy in this, actually, and in some ways Berlin's liberalism, from which I learned so much, is a tragic liberalism. But there's also sometimes comedy. And I feel that whenever I hear sages or political commentators on television or on YouTube or elsewhere writing, which they do about 2 or 3 times a year, and speaking about populism peaking. Is it peak? Oh yes, definitely. It's beginning to peak. And the thing is, they say this regularly 3 or 4 times a year, and it doesn't peak. And the reason it doesn't peak is partly to do with them, which is that they don't acknowledge that they have any role in the formation, in the emergence of this extremely powerful body of movements. They're standing behind, slightly baffled in a way, looking down on these phenomena and saying, how can people be so stupid? How can people be so ignorant? How can people fall for these demagogues? Or just regarding it as a kind of primordial eruption from the political unconscious. Why is it happening now and not before? Why is it happening everywhere and not just in 1 or 2 countries? They never answer these questions. That's comedy. And it leads to a kind of a basic problem at the moment, which is a sort of what I could describe as a kind of cognitive dissonance in the reactions. I don't like all this talk about elites and masses, but then the reactions of large sections of the political classes and of the academic classes, which is that they see a world which doesn't correspond to their preconceptions as to the way the world develops. History hasn't gone the way they think it was going to go, and in a sense even must go. So they're perpetually surprised by what happens. They were utterly shocked by the first election of Trump, and I would say even more shocked, even more profoundly shocked by his second election, which was more decisive and swept the board in terms of institutions. Not something I think almost any of them had considered possible. And I fear, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on in this brief talk, they're going to be more shocked because they're still basically thinking that we'll get back onto the default trajectory of modern history, which is basically that which they believe in. By the way, I don't know if you know the history I just mentioned, because it's in itself has an element of comedy of the term cognitive dissonance. It came from a study done in the 1950s by an American psychologist of UFO believers. He smuggled in members of his team into UFO cults, and they were all expecting the arrival of the UFOs. They believed that their leaders communicated with the UFO leaders somehow by interplanetary telepathy. They daily expect, and they gave a date and a time, and it didn't happen. Now you'd think that they would say, well, it didn't happen, we'll have to adjust our belief. No, not at all. They became even stronger in their beliefs, even more adamant, even more categorical. And I find that among this type of liberal, which is where they just become, it's more irrational than they thought. Perhaps it might take longer than we think to get back to the proper, but they think they're going to come back. I'm as confident as I can be of anything in politics, which is inherently in a very uncertain realm of human activity, that we won't go back to the pre-Trump or the pre-Brexit or we will not go back to it. That type is dead and gone. And the world that we already inhabit, and even more the world that we will inhabit in 2 or 3 years' time after Trump's presidency, because he is, I think, the dominant factor at the moment, is irrevocably changed. And yet, large areas of intellectual and political life hold on to this belief, this kind of cognitive dissonance. So my first point, I guess, is powerful populist movements are all but universal now. And I think they pretty well always emerge in the shadow of elements of liberalism. And I'll try and be a bit more precise about this type of liberalism that has emerged in the last, I would say, 20 years. I call it hyperliberalism, because what it does is it does represent some genuine, real liberal values, but it develops them to the point at which they undermine their own foundations and they become self-defeating. And this is the basic issue, I think, with this type of liberalism. Not that it was too ambitious or too optimistic, though it was, as our president has pointed out, or too hubristic. It's that it's actually self-defeating, in that it calls up from society the forces it fears. It calls them up, and when they emerge, it denounces them as vestiges, powerful vestiges, dangerous vestiges of and relics of an earlier period, which is really should have been left behind and was believed to be left behind, but somehow re-emerged. But it's nothing to do with the policies they adopt. And Fukuyama, a very decent man, by the way, I've had, as John mentioned, I've had conversations with him all over the world, including in Beijing. A very nice man. He's a cabinet maker and a carpenter, which I find rather charming, and very intelligent. And he does acknowledge some aspects of his analysis were mistaken. But it's basically, I think, still what it always was, which is the claim that with the end of the Cold War, only one type of government, which he calls democratic capitalism, a highly idealized version of Western liberal democracy, if you like, can be legitimate. All the rest have fallen away. Now, I thought, and I wrote a piece, I've got some quotes from it in October 1989, oddly enough, in a conservative magazine in America, where I said, this isn't the end of history. It's most likely the resumption of classical history as it used to be before the Cold War. It was the Cold War which was the anomaly, because it was a dichotomous. There were non-aligned peoples. There were the Indians and African nations who had a non-aligned group that were important. But essentially, it was a geopolitical, and China had not yet emerged fully as an independent power, an enormously important power. It was an essentially bipolar, dichotomous rivalry and at times set of proxy wars in Vietnam and Korea between two blocs in the world, both of them, interestingly enough, governed by Enlightenment philosophies which really did think that the human history was an unfolding of human possibilities and powers. There was regression, there were periods of stagnation, periods of decline, but basically it was the unfolding of a kind of progressive vision. Both sides held that. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and the wall went down, as I was writing this piece in American magazine for October 1989, the wall would come down very soon after. What I thought would happen, and I wasn't alone in this, by the way, a man I respected a lot, namely the first George Bush. He'd seen action in the Second World War, and like his son who he'd never had, he was a wise man, I think, in many ways. He knew where all the bodies were buried. He'd been right at the pinnacle of American power. He was a very intelligent man. He said, this is wonderful, but it's all going to be very difficult. And it turned out to be very difficult because the types of conflicts that had made up classical history, resource conflicts, religious conflicts, ethnic conflicts, geopolitical and conflicts which involved deep passages of human memory and human identity, returned, and of course in the Soviet Union and then in the Balkan Wars. And he said this is going to be very, very difficult. All these conflicts which have been suppressed and frozen over are going to emerge, and they did. When I said that, I said this will be history as usual, it was represented as apocalyptic pessimism, which tells you something about that age. You're already in an age of complete delusion. If you said history will go on as it used to do, oh, that's terribly pessimistic. Well, maybe it isn't a certain way. It's not apocalyptic. Apocalyptic means the opposite of that. Apocalyptic means everything stops and starts again in a new way. It wasn't, I was saying, be exactly as it was before. Fukuyama didn't really retreat much. When he published, I reacted in '89 to his magazine article, The End of History, which, by the way, in the magazine had a question mark after it. It did, but he removed it. And in this, I had maybe it was slightly bad taste on my part, but I reminded people at the time that two great British intellectuals, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, had written a book, published a book in the 30s called The Soviet Union, this is at the height of Stalinism, A New Civilization ? In the second and later editions, they took the question mark out. They were convinced it was a new civilization. I said, this is rather similar. This is the example, this is a political believer who sees this moment in history as an irreversible advance. They have some flaws, quite large, I think, in the case of Stalinism, but nonetheless, it's the future. So he stuck to that, and he's basically, I think, still stuck to that. And that, I think, is one of the big errors we need to get across. So my first point, I guess, if I can repeat it, because I think it's important, is not that the liberalism of the post-war period was simply, though it was, over-optimistic or even over-deterministic, which it also was, in the sense that it was, some people thought, a theory of historical inevitability. And that actually, it took longer, progress wasn't linear, there were more setbacks than many people thought. I think all of this is true. All of this is true, but it's not the basic truth, which is that this kind of liberalism produced its opposite, reciprocally and dialectically. Now, how did it do this? I think it did it in two ways. One was through involving itself in a series of armed conflicts of regime change, which could be known in advance, would not work. I mean, again, there was a kind of legend grow. If only they'd thought about it a bit more. If only they'd prepared. My view is if they had thought about it a bit more, they'd never have done it. If they thought about it for 10 consecutive minutes, they would have never invaded Iraq. And I used to talk occasionally at that time to sort of crusty old Foreign Office types and so on, and they would say, "Oh, this is going to be a complete disaster. The only predictable result is that Iran will be stronger." Then I went back and read about Gertrude Bell. Anybody know about Gertrude Bell? Wonderful lady, the female. It's a kind of slightly sexist way of putting it, but the female Lawrence of Arabia. She knew all the languages. She traveled all over the place by herself, nearly all the time in Iraq, when it was still a British colonial holding, deeply respected by everyone, never harassed, as far as I know, ever, who more or less created the state of Iraq on the back of a postcard. And one of the things she wrote about the state of Iraq was, of course, this can never be democratic, because it's divided between these two groups. If it becomes democratic, the state of Iraq will break up. So I wrote in the New Statesman in I think February of before the war was launched in March. I said the result of this will be, as Gertrude Bell predicted all those years ago, that was in the 1920s, the breakup of the state of Iraq. If you try and if you know just a little bit more history, it's not something that could have worked. As I've said, I used to go to Washington quite a bit in those days, and none of them had ever thought for even 5 minutes about it. But if they had, as I say, I did mention to a leading proponent of the war in a exchange, I had a public exchange in Poland. I did mention, I said, what do you think about Gertrude Bell's observations? And I have to tell you, you'd never heard of Gertrude Bell. Well, you shouldn't invade countries whose the name, when you don't know the name of the people who founded them. It's a sort of slightly dangerous piece of ignorance. And especially if you don't know the doubts she had about that state, it would break up, as it then did. But it was worse than I thought, because there was ISIS, there was the, I think, more or less genocidal attack on the Yazidi people, now being sort of slightly forgotten about, but terrible thing. It was worse than I thought. So now let me say something a little bit about the longer history of liberalism and where this, because although this hyperliberalism, as I call it, emerged after in its stronger forms after the Cold War, and I'll talk a little bit more about its domestic Western aspects in a moment. There are moments in the longer history of liberalism which anticipated in some ways, even in the canonical liberal John Stuart Mill, on whom, by the way, I spent 20 years of my life working. It became a long search for a joke in Mill. After 20 years, I came up with only one potential candidate in his autobiography, where he says, my father, James Mill, well, I do a Scottish utilitarian, believed that the human world would become better if we implemented a whole series of rational reforms, semicolon. But he never showed any enthusiasm at this prospect. And of course, Mill had a terrible mental breakdown in his late teens. Rather high-end neurosis. He said, I feared a world in which all musical melodies had already been discovered. He was romantic, rather charming in a way. But he also, I think, seeded liberalism with some of its later errors. But liberalism actually began, the word itself, what did come used as to describe a political movement or theory until the early 19th century in Spain. But what we now recognize as liberalism really came, I think, actually not from the Enlightenment, not primarily from the Enlightenment, though there were many distinguished later Enlightenment liberals like Mill himself, but actually from Christianity, and earlier than that from Judaism. I think there was something in the great proponents of freedom of speech, like John Milton, for example, in this country, of an Augustinian idea. I'm not a Christian myself, but I admire this aspect of Christianity. I'm not a theist, actually, either. But in which it's basically an idea that the world, there are two, there may be a world of God, a world of eternity, and then there's the world of history and the world of time. But the world of time is infused by the contradictions of human beings, that the human beings are a peculiarly conflicted species. You don't find cats, I kept cats for many years, or they kept me, as they're about to snatch the mouse, holding back and saying, I wonder if I should do this. No, they just leap immediately on the mouse and consume the mouse. Now, we don't want to become like cats in that respect. Human beings have a deeply divided nature in that they cannot achieve the goals and visions that they have for this world. And I think we find that in Augustine, and before that, even in the Book of Job, which is, I suppose, if there's any message in it, is that this world is a chronically unjust place, but we can recognize that we must protest against it, but we must somehow learn to live in it, and why we resisted. And I think what then happened with liberalism was partly when Puritan liberalism, that Puritan tradition, migrated to the United States. It became more of a moral frenzy in which the brokenness of human beings, the imperfectibility of human beings, the inward contradictions of human beings, which are acknowledged in Augustinian Christianity, were forgotten. And if you then think that you yourself, the Puritan man or woman, have none of these vices or contradictions, you feel free to persecute and kill and hunt down people who deviate from your values, like the witch craze, which then happened in America, and which I think was a sense renewed with woke. But there is a domestic aspect of hyperliberalism, which I think is very important, and again is misunderstood. Another kind of common statement or impression of kind of view that you see is we should stop these culture wars. They're really bad, which they are, and divisive. But we should get beyond them. Now I wonder about that, because what are these wars what actually brings them into being? Is it not at least partly that a certain type of liberal ruling class wants to remodel society according to a rational design, which embodies their values? So they change lots of things in the society. Language has to be controlled and policed all the time in case you slip back into atavism. The way sports are done, the way universities appoint people and fire people, the way museums conduct themselves, all these activities and institutions of practice have to be transformed. And then if, according to a model, see Timothy Gardner-Nash just arriving, I'm happy to say, he might not agree with everything I've just said.
I had it on YouTube.
Oh, you did it. Then he knows. But we've had many interesting conversations in the past, and I'm sure we will again. But these culture wars really can again be seen as reactive phenomena. That's to say, they're, I think, mostly forms of resistance to the attempt to impose a model on people, which are large numbers of those people don't recognize as being relevant or suitable to the types of lives they've lived, which in liberal societies in Britain were really a kind of informal, miscellaneous rubbing along together, coexisting in an informal modus vivendi, breaking down in the 17th century, having some bad periods towards the end of the 19th century. There was anti-Chinese xenophobia and racism, for example, against Irish people, among others. So it's, and of course later on, there have been against the Windrush generation, there have been many imperfections in that, and even some terrible crimes. And of course, anti-Semitism as a long phenomena in Britain and other countries now, I think, has resurged both on the woke left and on the anti-woke right. But still, there was a kind of an informal model. Didn't work in Ireland or Northern Ireland all the time. It had to be, people like John had to keep it going and reinvent it, and his colleagues. But that kind of informal rubbing along, rather individualistic, rather tolerant in the old sense of the term of diversity, was not what they recognized when the attempt was made to sort of clean up the language, restructure the language, change a lot of practices. And so when people say we should forget about we should get beyond that. What they mean is that the people who resist it should shut up. Well, they don't shut up, actually, and they won't shut up. And in every country, the Czech Republic, Jan Hus's Czech Republic, Japan, all the social democratic Sweden, impeccably hyperliberal Ireland, in all these countries, there is this enormous counter movement, the populist movement. So we have to, the precondition of understanding this is that it's a dialectical relationship. It's not something that people stand back and say, oh, this, our former prime minister, when he was asked about something, he said, oh, that's just populism. Nothing to do with him. Comes from nowhere, from the dark depths of the soul. Now, there's one sense in which that's correct, which is Freud's sense of the return of the repressed. I speak to a former practicing psychotherapist and psychoanalyst in John, which is that if certain aspects of human beings who are constituted by memory, by the language they've learned to speak, by their identities, by their communities, not wholly constituted, they're not always trapped in it. They can have several identities. They can move from one to the other if they've got a main one. But they're constituted by these things. If these things are delegitimated, dissolved in the acids of universal liberal norms, they react. They don't actually just. I mean, I knew that Trump was going to win in the first time within hours of Hillary Clinton's use of the term the deplorables. 40% of the population. Now, I haven't studied cephalogically, but I think that was a symbolic act. These people need to be left behind. Well, they're not going to take that very lightly. They feel they're being despised, which in effect they were being dismissed. When I talk to some of my American liberal friends, even hyper-liberal friends, I managed to keep. They say, well, maybe, if she'd explained it, I said, you mean she should have said it 2 or 3 times louder? If she told them they were deplorable 3 or 4 times more and just sort of insisted on them, that would have worked, would it? I don't think so. There were other reasons, obviously. That was only one reason. But from that moment, I thought, Trump's going to win. And I gave a talk on the radio, BBC radio, saying Trump's going to win. Partly for that reason. That I think was a kind of key reason. So that's the way in which hyperliberalism evokes its opposite, evokes its own nemesis, if you like. Let's hope it's not a nemesis, but it evokes its own shadow in domestically speaking. And I'll just mention briefly, because I don't want to talk too long. This is a dialogue, not a formal lecture. There are elements of that in Mill and in other liberals. In Mill, I think that one of the decisive moments was when he fell in love with Auguste Comte's Religion of Humanity. It was at that moment that liberalism actually, I think, became a religion. Because what he says is it's a better religion than any religion that has ever existed. It's a strange religion, by the way. It was closely connected in Comte with phrenology. It had a daily ritual of touching the different parts of the skull, which were associated with benevolence and order. It was slightly comical religion, but very influential on writers like George Eliot, spread all over the world. Mill fell in love with that, but was worried about it because Mill was a very perceptive thinker. He worried about Comte's love of system and Comte's belief that if this new religion could be adopted, then lots of profound questions could be solved by scientific expert judgment. Comte actually wrote, there's no more need for free speech in morality than there is in chemistry. And I think that view, which Mill was both repelled by and found attractive in a certain way, as part of the religion of humanity, crept into liberalism later in the idea that, which Mill was explicit about, he said, when I talk about utility, I mean utility for man. He used that archaic term, as a progressive being. As a progressive being. In other words, I would say he invoked a kind of metaphysical figment. He wasn't really an empiricist. In his great book, The System of Logic, which was used for 60 years by British universities, including in Scotland, he says there are laws of human development, what he calls the science of ethology. Very, very interesting argument, but that's one minor defect. He never mentions one of these laws. Doesn't give us any examples of them. What are they, these laws? They're yet to be discovered. Well, are there universal laws of scientific development? Here, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'll just read something and then draw this to a close from Isaiah Berlin. Sorry, from Isaiah Berlin, when he wrote about this in his wonderful essay, A Sense of Reality. Let me see if I can find this. Then I'll close up with a few more remarks, which on how this dialectical relationship has worked out today. Berlin writes, let me see if I can find it. Here it is. He's writing in this essay, in the book called A Sense of Reality, of how liberal and other political projects and visions fail. And he said they don't fail because there are iron laws of history that they try to break. They don't fail because the projects are too optimistic or too linear in their conception of progress, or think that human societies can become perfectible. That isn't why they fail. They fail because they don't understand the deep unconscious texture and structure of human life. That part of it which isn't explicitly manifested, but which comes out in many ways. And he writes, when we speak of forces too great to be resisted, we do not mean we have come up against an iron law. We mean that there is too much that we do not know but dimly surmise about the situation, and that the means at our disposal may not be efficacious enough to overcome these unknown and half-known factors and of their effect on this or that actual situation. We rightly admire statesmen who, without pretending to detect laws, are able to do more than others to accomplish their plans because of a superior sense of the contours of these unknown and half-known factors, menacing often precisely because they're too difficult to analyze. So he intended, when he wrote that, he was really mostly, I think, criticizing certain types of Marxism. But I think that applies equally, with equal force, to certain types of liberalism. They have these ideas, these principles, if they do X, Y, Z, they shouldn't be too optimistic, but they should keep pressing on. And by the way, one form in which that idea is expressed is, I think, one of the great errors of recent discourse, both liberal and left-wing, and even right-wing, which is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Do you know that phrase? It comes from, I think, thought to come from Bertolt Brecht, but I think was really first used by Roland, the French liberal, actually. He first used it. So it means you recognize the difficulties, but you press on. I think it's exactly what we shouldn't do. It just means pressing on with the errors you've been making, repeating the errors on a larger scale and hoping it will somehow turn out right. It's a disastrous idea, actually. What you should rather do is try and understand why you did fail, why it didn't happen, why what you expected didn't happen. And that was, I think, something that Berlin also held. I'll wind up with a story Berlin told me about the Second World War. He spent most of the war in Washington, working from the embassy, trying to find out, and even to some extent influence, politicians and others on the issue of coming into the war on Britain's side. Because like Churchill, to whom he submitted his reports directly, he went on Churchill's desk, or on his bed, actually, because he seems to have read them in bed quite a bit of the time when he had his afternoon rests and so on. They both thought that if the Americans didn't come into the war, we were sunk. So that was his goal there. But he told me a story which I think illustrates the character of his liberalism, the tragic side of it, which is that during the Second World War, I think I can get this right, a government minister appeared in the typing pool of his ministry, in which there were about 20 people. And he announced, I'm going to do a very wrong thing now, a very unjust thing and the wrong thing. I'm going to fire you all. And the reason I'm going to fire you all is that one of you, we think only one, has been leaking information to the enemy. And we haven't got time to find out who that person is. In the meantime, brave men and women are dying, sometimes under torture, in terrible circumstances, because leaks have been going out. I'm going to fire the whole lot of you. Now, you have to remember what that meant. Not one of them would ever get another job in anything, because there'd be a security black mark over them. It ruined their lives irreparably, irreparably. And that, it seems to me that there is in Berlin's liberalism, there was indeed in the Second World War, actually. We had to ally ourselves with the other power without whom we might not have been able to win the war, prevail in the war, was Russia, Soviet Russia. Over 20 million dead. And a terrible system. We had to do that in those circumstances to avoid the even darker prospect of a long-term Nazified Europe. But this wasn't, according to Berlin, and this is the deep truth of his value of pluralism, it wasn't the kind of utilitarian trade-off. You couldn't get some clever experts in who'd work out the U-tiles and say, well, you know, there's 383 U-tiles of sacking all these people, but we saved 521 U-tiles by if we do that. It's a tragic conflict, because what you're doing is not enacting or making a trade-off. What you're doing when you do that is inflicting an intolerable harm. Doing the right thing sometimes involves doing an irreparable harm. So it's that aspect of his liberalism which I think is the hardest for many, but it's what value of pluralism and one of its implications really means. But there's a second part of it which is equally important, which is that Berlin recognized that reasonable and decent human beings could make different choices in these circumstances. There wouldn't just be one choice. The choice that the government minister made, he thought was the right choice, I think was the right choice. But it's not cut and dried. Someone might say, well, maybe it is the right, but I'm not doing it. I won't add to the injustice of the world by, there are only 20 people there, but 19 of them are going to have their lives comprehensively and irreparably ruined by, I just won't do it. Maybe that could be also. So it's back to the way we started, which is that the pursuit of agreement in politics or in liberalism, the pursuit of a rational consensus, a rational model, and then trying to impose it on the benighted, backward-looking people in societies that don't share it yet, is what I think has produced this populist response. There are other reasons: globalization, economic dislocation. We forget what happened to many towns in Britain and even more in America, where industrial activities which have sustained whole communities just stopped because they were offshored. And so I think that's important too. There's a material aspect. This was very important. But the basic problem was not simply economic dislocation or, on the other hand, inequality. That's also been a very important factor, that the incomes of even majorities have stagnated or fallen back, while the incomes of a few have gone ahead. The basic problem was imposing a pattern, trying to impose a pattern, trying to impose values on people that didn't share them. In other words, not only did they not share them, but in many cases they were deeply divided. I'll end with this one final observation, which I think is on America now, which is that one of the features of hyperliberalism, as I've called it, was liberal legalism. It was the idea that rather than resolving issues like abortion, like the end of life, to just take two examples, through political processes, through compromises, through agreements, through legislation, they should be transferred to judicial arbitration. Now, the key thing about that, and I wrote about this in the early 90s, is if you do that, you make the judicial institutions objects of political, targets of political capture. The key thing, if you do that, if it's an intensely contested issue, like as abortion was, more in America than here, if maybe a third of the population feels very, very strongly about it in a negative way, and another third feels very, very strongly about it in a pro-choice way, if you transfer it, the whole thing, and produce a right, which is then a feature of the Constitution, it may take 30 years, which it did actually, but what you'll then find is that there'll be a concerted attack on the institutions the judicial, the Supreme Court that upholds this. And this is what has happened. And the irony or the paradox, or even the tragedy of liberal legalism, as of hyperliberalism in general, is that it generates its own downfall, which is that now basically Trump owns the American justice system. He owns it in the sense that he's using it to pursue his enemies. He owns it in the sense that he stacked the Supreme Court in his first period, so that it would, for example, be sympathetic to overturning the Voter Registration Act, I think of 1965, which was developed to avoid racial gerrymandering, stopping black people voting, in other words. It looks as if the post-Trump Supreme Court is going to do that. Now, the consequence of that is that it makes it much less likely that he'll lose in the midterms. Even if he does lose in the midterms, by the way, I think he might say it's another hoax. So we now get to the really heart of it all, which is the most disturbing, which is that the country that primarily led wars of regime change is now undergoing a regime change of its own, or looks as if it might. And not just a temporary deviation into some rather weird policies, but a regime change into something different. And I think we'll know this. It needn't remain a point of speculation when we see how Trump does respond to the midterms, if really he suffers, which seems likely because of the economy and other factors, does he accept it? Or does he then use his executive powers not to accept it? Because, or if the Supreme Court allows gerrymandering, and so he wins or prevails again, he has his whole term to change American policy. So this is what this comes back to, is my positive point, which is that that John mentioned earlier, and that he was involved in himself. What's the solution for this? Well, I won't try to provide particular solutions, but it's that what you need is constructive political practice, not transferring everything out to laws, to justices. There needs to be a framework, might be a more minimal framework, but unless you actually engage and get people to engage with each other, with their different views, unless you can come up, as we did in this country, actually, I don't say it's perfect, with a compromise on abortion, which most people were happy with. I'm definitely not happy with the recent changes whereby it can be extended up to the point of birth, and I'm pro-choice. I think that's, that's taking a principle, a right, too far. But we pursued that political route. So the solution, I think, if there is one, to the self-defeating tendencies, the self-defeating logic of hyperliberalism, is politics. Now, at a time when we're all very skeptical of politicians and mistrustful and even contemptuous of them, it seems kind of it seems counterintuitive. So that, I think, it is. It means back to politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, John. And I'd like to see if we can take the conversation along a little bit. And I want to take the opportunity of the chair to just raise one or two questions with you, and then other colleagues will undoubtedly have questions and comments that they want to make. I think the first thing I want to say is, as I sat here and listened to you, I was very struck by the place where we're sitting. You know, at the time when this place was built, it was the height of empire.
Yes.
The biggest empire the world has ever seen was run from the street outside. Liberals would meet here in the National Liberal Club. And they would walk down Whitehall and vote on the basis of the discussions they'd had in this building. And that would have repercussions right across the world. And then it all started to go to pieces. And I suppose that was the sort of thought that I had in my mind. I wonder what it was like for them whenever they began to realize that it was all dissolving, it was all fragmenting, this powerful, extraordinary, intellectually credible edifice was all beginning to dissolve. Because it feels to me, and I think it feels like this to an awful lot of people, that that's what we're in now.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the differences perhaps was that at that time, and you mentioned Sidney and Beatrice Webb, there were people who had an alternative set of propositions. You know, empire will go, we will bring in democracy, we're not going to allow ourselves to continue to be governed by bishops and princes and so on. Everybody will have their say and things will be so much better. I'm not sure, maybe I'm missing it, but I'm not sure that those who have become dissatisfied and see what's happening are putting forward an alternative set of propositions other than what's here will dissolve and something better will emerge. And it might or might not.
Very much might or might not. I mean, perhaps will not, because there's nothing very clear or definite in the way of a populist program. There are a series of reactive policies on different issues. The economics of populism are very unclear. It used to be said that they were all Thatcherite tribute acts, free markets. Well, you can't say that now after Trump. Whatever else it is, it's not Margaret Thatcherite, I don't think. Protectionism. Beyond that, actually, now they're talking, making active plans for state ownership of particular enterprises. There's this tremendous fusion of private interests and public power over the crypto experiment that they're involved in. So that's kind of one. But your basic problem, your basic question was something different, I think, but very, very real, which is that I think if you want to look at the anxieties about liberal society, the Edwardian period is very fascinating. Because when you have writers like H.G. Wells and others saying, well, supposing science makes all these leaps, what will it bring us? Well, in the island of Dr. Moreau, one of the great, and he was a great progressive, let's not forget. Not exactly a liberal, but a great progressive. It brought us something frightening. But the First World War, that cataclysm, that European Civil War, as it's been called, destroyed traditional elites and much of European society. But it shook, but didn't demolish the great old house in England. The empire was still there. It actually grew after the First World War. It was still all there. It had mortality. If you look closely, you could see the signs of mortality in it, but it was still there. So but I think it is true that insofar as the people who used to use this room 100 years ago were confident, it was because of an accident of British imperial hegemony and more generally of Western hegemony in the world. Very few people could imagine a world in which China would be a potential hegemon, which I think it is a potential. If there is any hegemon, there may not be, because it's not clear that India would accept such a hegemony, or that Japan ultimately even would accept such a. You might have a world without a hegemon, which in a different way is even more a single hyperpower, more frightening. But your other point is that there were these people, there were worked out programs. By the way, that was something I participated in, at least as an observer, the Thatcherism. When Thatcher sort of back in the 70s, under the influence of various right-wing think tanks and people like Keith Joseph, adopted her alternative program for Britain. That had been worked out over about 30 years all over the world. There were think tanks all over the world. I knew some of the people in them in America, not just America, in Austria and in Germany. They've been working on these free market ideas. Hayek and others have been working. Friedman, different philosophies, quite different in some ways, but for 30 years. And they were relatively simple ideas, actually. That had a great advantage. They were too simple, actually. Too much too simple. But they were very, as long as we did 3 or 4 things, it would work. And interestingly, she did try and do, and partly succeed in doing those 3 or 4 things. Restrict the powers of trade unions, cut back public spending, strengthen the state in some respects and withdraw it in other respects. That was, and she did. What she didn't do is she didn't understand the unintended consequences. Hayek used to always say, the trouble with socialism is that it has unintended consequences. I used to say, and was not generally applauded for saying this in those days, but freeing up the market has unintended consequences. You leave whole communities on life support, dying, or not exactly dying, going into some strange posthumous existence all over the country. So all of these big changes have these self-defeating or harmful and unintended consequences, as well as whatever they achieve. But that's the difference between there being no populist think tanks, partly because it's an intellectual movement. A few people have emerged, floated up, handful. No one's worked it out. So basically, that's one of the reasons for being worried, because if it's the case that the populist, it's not yet, by the way, carved in stone that there will be a popular reform government in Britain. I think it's more likely than it was before, because it is beginning to attract high-level defectors. Danny Kruger, Eton, Oxford, PhD, book, and he knows British politics inside out. There's not yet bigger money behind it, which there was in America, big tech money. But I think if there is, then the momentum will begin moving. But still, it's not settled because other things are happening. There's a left-wing populism among the Greens, eco-populists, call themselves populists, the new leader. It's on the right as well as the left. Rejection of traditional elites. We want a completely new system. But what new system? You can also ask the left, well, you're going to abolish landlords. Well, been tried before, you know. It has certain side effects which can be rather uncomfortable, especially for lower income people. So I agree completely with you. There isn't a clear, worked out alternative. And there isn't actually a universal solution. That's the key thing. I think we're used, if you're liberals or Marxists or progressive, that there's some just if you think populism is everywhere now, there must therefore be a solution which fits everywhere. It's not. I don't think that's the case at all. I think if there is a way of countering the negative features of populism and overcoming it, it'll be different in Britain than it is in America, than it is in France, than it is in Germany, than it has been in Sweden, than it has been in Denmark or Japan. Because what in each case they were reacting against was a model which seemed to disrupt the practices and traditions that you'd had before, and they were different. So the British model of government is quite different from it's still, even to this day, one in which power is not in the hands of the Supreme Court. There is a Supreme Court and it makes important judgments, but ultimately it's Parliament. And that could still be the case, I think, after the next election, whether that delivers a hung Parliament, which I think is actually quite possible, or whether it delivers a reform majority, or a reform which can form a majority, or alternatively, it delivers a Parliament in which all the non-reform parties, we now have a 7-party system, form coalition against reform and keep it out of power, which I think is actually equally likely. What I fear then is that they'll make the same mistakes that the progressive parties have made now, and that'll break down a couple of years later, or 18 months later. But equally, a reform government could break down in 18 months. Where they've taken over in local authorities, the result has not been, they've assumed there's some pot of money there somewhere. And they just got to get their hands on it and make these. Turns out there isn't. So what do they do then? Well, the answer is they disappoint people. And if that happens at a large scale, you're in a really difficult circumstances. So that's why the only thing I can say is we should be prepared for this situation in thought before it happens.
Yeah.
If we prepare, we maybe start thinking about it. We start thinking about policies, even policies. I'm not talking about policies tonight. That might mitigate these problems. We might be in the hands of fate, alas. I don't think we are yet, but we might end up being, because, and then I can I'm sure you have some other issues to pursue. But if there is a trust-like episode on a larger scale before the next election, because to me, what Truss did was obviously absurd, but it was more important in revealing fragilities in our public finances than in the silly things it proposed. And if we had a stock market crash, a crypto crash, a sovereign debt crisis in Britain, I'm not saying we'll have any of these, but they're all possible, or a sovereign debt crisis in America, the biggest of all, or in France. All of those things could accelerate the electoral timetable. We could get to a situation where there is a change of leader in Labour, or Starmer himself calls an earlier election, or whatever. We're in the realms of hypothesis now. But I myself can't imagine that something like the present government in Britain will stay its full term. I think there are too many other things that can happen in the world. If there's only one or two, but there are 3 or 4 big things that could happen, including, very sadly, we haven't talked about it at night, further Russian aggression in Europe. If it turns out that Trump does back away, this mercurial figure backs away and really makes clear. I mean, people say, well, they hope he won't. They think, well, if he backs away, he can come back. Well, the trouble is, if he's oscillating all the time, you can't really plan anything. You can't really do anything. You can't have any assurance on which you can base plans. And so that could also happen in the Baltic states or elsewhere, that Putin, having achieved what he has achieved, but nonetheless being relatively weak in Ukraine in some respects in the war, and also being far from strong in Russia itself, may decide to up the ante. And so what happens then? So any of those things could change the picture radically quite quickly, I think.
I could be very greedy and keep on asking you questions myself.
Well, I have too long an
but that wouldn't be fair. And I want to give some other colleagues the opportunity to ask questions, and maybe to take 2 or 3 and let you respond to them.
Yeah.
One of the people who has picked up on this question of what's happening in Europe and how we might address that is yourself, Timothy. So I wonder if I might invite Timothy Garton-Ash to make an intervention. Mike Hardy, I know that you've also been meeting with some of the colleagues in Europe and talking about that. And I've got one of our Liberal Democrat colleagues who focuses himself on foreign affairs. So perhaps we could take the 3 of you to put a question or make a comment, and then come back to yourself, John, to comment to us.
Thank you very much. I must start by apologizing profusely for being so scandalously late. It's entirely the fault of the Great Western Railway. But I did hear most of the beginning of your lecture on my phone, on YouTube, and it was terrific. I want to take you back in a slightly different direction to a short book about liberalism written nearly 40 years ago by a brilliant young scholar who identified 4 key dimensions of the liberal concept of man and society. He said it was individualist, universalist, egalitarian, and meliorist, i.e. believing in the possibility of improving social and political institutions. And by the way, the name of the brilliant young scholar was John Gray. Now, assuming you still agree with him,
I do.
I wonder what you would say to the proposition that the dimension in which liberalism has arguably most failed in those 40 years has been the egalitarian, both in culture and in economics, because after all, these populisms always have both an economic and a cultural dimension. Now, I think your argument is compelling in the cultural dimension, hyperliberalism provoking its response. Ronnie Dworkin says the essence of liberalism is equal respect and concern. Well, you don't show equal respect and concern if you describe people as a basket of deplorables. But don't you think the economic aspect of that is as important? As well, economic hyperliberalism, which leads to soaring inequality, and the fact that those same people in our society who are being disrespected culturally also do not enjoy what Ralph Dahrendorf called the common flaw that is essential to liberalism.
Thanks very much. Let's take 2 more interventions and then come back to yourself, John.
So, Mike Hardy, John, thank you so much for a very stimulating conversation. Like Karl-Heinz, I was also in Prague at Forum 2000. So specific, in addition to Tim's view, there we were talking about the recession, the democratic recession or democratic deficit, indeed. But my interest is in what liberalism has to bring to the issue about polarization, populism, which is very linear. So one of the things that came out strongly in the discussions in Prague was that actually the world is much more complex. It's not an either or, it's not a black or white. And that this notion of complexity, what have we got to say about that? And one dimension of that, one issue, I think, that's really important for us is the issue of age and the issue of generations. So I wondered those 2 things. What does liberalism help us with complexity, and what does it help us in terms of seeing how generational issues can move us forward? Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. I feel incredibly stimulated after that tour de horizon that you've offered us. My name's Dr. Al Pinkerton. I'm the new Member of Parliament, or fairly new Member of Parliament for Surrey Heath, as well as the Liberal Democrat spokesperson on Europe, and previously on Northern Ireland. And in my former life, I was a professor of geopolitics at Royal Holloway University, and many of the subjects you were talking about tonight resonate closely with what I used to work through with my students. I'm intrigued by the last 3 words of your talk, the sense of reality, because I think one of the points of reflection that I have on your lecture this evening is that, and please do come back on me if I pick this up incorrectly, but I think there's a certain assumption in what you've said that the wokeness, the hyperliberalism, as you describe it, is in fact real at all. And I wonder the extent to which it is in fact real, or whether it is in fact an incredibly carefully and cleverly conjured piece of theatre that the British public and indeed international publics are being asked to consume by, in fact, the forces of what you might think of as performative conservatism, who very clearly use and create and stoke fear in order to do the most basic thing of all, and that is to win support and popularity. And so one of the things you haven't really reflected on tonight is the way that the media, right-wing media and social media that seeds disinformation and misinformation at a cultural and societal scale that we are not accustomed to previously. I wonder what effect that has in creating the very devices that are then weaponized for political gain by the counter forces of hyperliberalism, if hyperliberalism is in fact a thing at all. And the reason I say this is because we're all terribly fearful now, if you believe the newspapers, about critical race theory. We're worried about it in 2025, despite the fact that critical race theory has its origins in the 1960s and 1970s, and nobody gave a damn about it for 50 years. And we're all very worried about gender, even though the Gender Recognition Act came in 2014. And in British India, you could have one of 3 different genders on your passports, and nobody seemed to give a damn about that either. As I've just said, I'm a new MP, and one of the greatest things I've done in my first year of being elected is I've been a member of something called the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. In fact, I'm wearing the tie of that scheme this evening because we had our graduation dinner last night, and perhaps the most fascinating element of the Armed Forces Scheme for me was that we were taken down to Newbury to visit the Army's 77th Brigade, the anti-Russian disinformation brigade. And what we heard there was both extraordinary and terrifying. Because every single day, Russia, as you would expect, are attacking our physical electronic infrastructure, Jaguar Land Rover and the NHS and gov.uk come under constant assault. But what we perhaps don't realize, or if we do, we perhaps don't realize the extent to which this happens, is that our hearts and minds are under assault every single day from an incredibly sophisticated and fast-moving Russian disinformation process that seeds disinformation throughout our society. And sometimes that is obvious. Vladimir Zelensky is a Nazi. Vladimir Zelensky has multiple multi-million-pound houses in Florida, owns super yachts, and is stealing gold and all kinds of other things. But that disinformation also seeds the kind of everyday disinformation that now begins to shape our society. I see it in my MP's inbox every single day. Chemtrails in the air because they're part of a global government program to change the weather, to make us all more depressed than we already are. We can't even make the trains run on time. I don't think there's a global government out there changing the weather. Or vaccine denialism, or concern about ULEZ schemes and 15-minute cities. And why does Russia do that? Because it seeds distrust between government and the public, so that we become constantly questioning about the sense of reality that we have. And so I put this as a proposition to you, and that is, to what extent does the hyperliberalism that you talk about truly exist? Or is it, in fact, a mirage that disappears the closer you come to it?
Thank you. These are wonderful questions, all three of them. Maybe I'll try and answer the last first. I'm afraid hyperliberalism does exist. I mean, I was in New York when as I mentioned earlier, actually, when the first Trump victory was announced. And my impression then was, which I checked by speaking to the head of security at one of the tech titans. I thought the Russians had been up to something here, but it probably didn't amount to very much. It didn't explain the result. So I contacted him. I said, were they activists? Yes. You got evidence of that? Definitely. Did it make any difference or much? No. And so I felt at the time that a liberal response, which is universal almost in New York at the time, which was to find the explanation of this catastrophe in an exogenous event, an exogenous force. It's nothing to do, or not much to do, with the deep fissures of inequality, of disrespect, of whole portions, not only the abandoned working class industrial communities in the American Rust Belt, but of a huge middle class or ex-middle class precariat who had to have 2 or 3 or even 4 jobs between 2 of them to maintain a standard of living that 20 or 30 years before could have been maintained. I'm not saying a patriarchal society is best, but on one, that would be 2 or 3 or 4. And nothing to do with that, it was the Russians. I thought this was an outbreak of mass delusion. It was one of the, it's the only time I've ever lived through one. I thought it was very interesting because it was clear to me, and I did check this, that although the Russians do intervene, they do much worse than the things you mentioned. They assassinate people, they have sabotage programs. They are at war with us, actually, although penny hasn't dropped fully here. They've already begun the war, not only in the Baltic states but also in Britain. It's entirely the case, and part of the urgency of our situation is that their time scale for action is shorter than ours. Most people I've talked to say that we'd need at least 5 years, maybe 10 or even 15, to get up to snuff to be able to resist a major assault without an American backstop. I think it's a consensus among people who know about these things. I'm not an expert, but I've consulted them. That the Russian timetable is 3 to 5 years. And partly this is a result of the deindustrialization that went with offshoring, and the German economic business model was essentially involved a mixture of Russian energy and Chinese trade. They both blown up in their face. So it's a consequence, if you like, of this illusion, not just the earlier Ostpolitik, but later on, the idea that that Trump ridiculed in his coarse way, but which actually turned out to be right, which is that in the United Nations, that this reliance on Russian energy is part of a broad strategy. It was very dangerous and essentially fragile. So he was right about all that. So I think it is, and my reason for thinking this, and come back to Timothy and also the earlier comment as well, is that the reality of, it's not a construction of the right, because it's actually breaking down in America now. Some of the most fierce and savage, and I think potentially significant consequences are within MAGA. Within MAGA. Trump is very vulnerable, I believe, to further revelations from the Epstein files. A lot of what he's been doing is distraction, or at least he believes he is. I mean, by the way, people have said, has Putin got something on him? I don't know, I have no idea. But what I think is quite possible is that Trump believes Putin has something on him. And he doesn't know, since there could be so many different things, which it is. So if I had to imagine, I have no idea, these cryptic telephone calls and meetings in Alaska, which Trump seems to think is outside the United States, because he says he'd been to outside the United States twice, must have been. But I can imagine the enigmatic smile and the long silences of Putin, feeding this fear in Trump. Not that he knows about X, Y, Z, but just he knows something, which he might well do, if anyone does, which could be very significant. So that could be an important factor. Not that he's always been an agent or a Manchurian candidate. I don't believe that for a moment. He's too unreliable, too egocentric, could never be trusted to take orders or do things when he's supposed to be done. But that he's somehow compromised, and that he fears this. But independently of that now, I think he lives in dread of the revelations coming out of the Oversight Committee, leaks and other things. I mean, there was the Bloomberg, and this may have something to do with the attacks he's launched on the American intelligence agencies and communities. He's attacked them all. He sacked people he doesn't like, gets rid of them. But there'll be lots of people in lower ranks, but fairly high up, who wouldn't like this at all in the FBI and elsewhere. So what it's actually we're witnessing there is something like the internecine conflicts that go with an attempted regime change. And that leads me to believe that hyperliberalism was real. And I tell you why I think it was real, because I saw it in the American Academy all those years before, decades before. We've got to get abortion, right to abortion, established as a completely unchallengeable right. Take it out of politics. And as I say, I'm pro-choice. I thought, this is a terrible idea. Inexorably, what will then happen is that these institutions will become targeted. So that's real. That really has happened. It took a long time. Critical race studies, it was in the campus, just in the campus section for decades. It didn't stay in the campus. What's in the campus emerges from the campus into the larger society. So I fear it is real. It was real, and it's working itself out in real forces in America now. And that one of the reasons why I said one of the things that is not going to happen, I believe, is very low probability, or zero, or less than zero, if there can be such a thing, in America, is a reversion to, certainly not in the Republican Party, but people who are emerging in the public. Vance has the great advantage and disadvantage, two great advantages and disadvantages. They're both of them. One is he believes in most of this stuff, Trump doesn't. The second is he can't be flattered. Much harder to flatter. And it's more radical on a lot of these issues, including foreign policy. He's a strong skeptic of not only of Israel engagement, but of Europe engagement. This is all real. So if he succeeds in following Trump may, I have friends one or two friends in America I talk to occasionally, what will Trump do as it gets closer to, if he lives that long and if his health problems don't get worse? What will Trump do as he gets closer? He'll burn the house down. He'll try and destroy Vance. He'll try and do, because he's a complete narcissist and egotist, but he'll try and do that. But Vance is there. RFK has ambitions. Bannon has ambitions. Now everybody's saying, utterly unthinkable. Well, think back 10 years. Said that about Trump. You can't imagine Bannon as president. Well, it is hard to imagine, but I can imagine. Anything is possible now, particularly given that the response of the Democrats has so far been so feeble. And I interpret that as a cognitive crisis. The world they thought they knew and the country they thought they knew vanished before their eyes, not because a surreal version of it was projected, not primarily by exogenous by Russia and Iran and China in their different ways, Russia being the most obvious, but because it was distorted and it involved redacting. The progressive mind in America is an auto-redacting machine. It redacts out of its perceptions what it doesn't like and what it can't understand. It's just not really there. It is there, and then it emerges. 120,000 people show up in the middle of London, orchestrated by an American-financed Tommy Robinson. There were about 120,000, I believe. They weren't all responding to Russian propaganda. They were mobilized by this figure, Robinson. And this leads to me, by the way, which is that I don't fear Farage as much as I fear what happens after he fails. I fear these darker forces. And they're not only on the right, as I mentioned, but they're also now appearing on the left. So that's my, then Tim's very wise observations. I don't mean the ones that he mentions me, but it is, economics played a big role. But in a sense, economics was part of the project of globalization, which was a hyperliberal project. It was the idea that at least on the economic side, some people would say, well, it'll take a long time for the Chinese to become democratic. I mean, they've seen what happened in Russia. They're not going to do it easily. I used to talk to banks back in the early 90s, and they would all say, yes, it's inexorable evolution towards a liberal market in China. Well, I never really believed this. First of all, the Communist Party never went away. It had its people in all the critical places, in all the big companies. It'd be at least a kind of basement somewhere where it'd be the party chap. It turned out to be very old woman. It turned out to be very important when anything came up. They never surrendered control completely. And it was not a kind of process of evolution whereby throughout the world market capitalism was coming to be, which Fukuyama believed, at least quite recently. It was a series of political decisions taken in China which could be and were reversed when Xi Jinping consolidated his power and turned it from being what many people thought was a proto-version of a liberal market economy under authoritarian auspices to what it is now, which is a mercantilist power under semi-totalitarian auspices. And so that's what we've got to face up to as a gigantic political fact. And so I think Tim is right to, and this I think is slightly missed actually by Fukuyama himself, because although he talks about economics, he focuses a lot on the way in which boredom, Nietzsche, so on, The Last Man is in the title of his book. Nietzsche predicted an age of boredom. I don't think that populism emerges from boredom. I think populism emerges from despair or fury, not boredom. You can, but of course, boredom can morph into drug taking and the huge numbers of people who are perishing in the United States. And even that can be accentuated and aggravated by foreign powers, because a lot of the fentanyl, it's not a conspiracy theory. I think it's just a fact that the fentanyl, some of it does ultimately come from China. But the real reason, or the deeper reason, is the feeling of emerging from, of having no productive place in society. If you have no productive, what is your stake in it then anymore? You will be open to disinformation, as you say, but I think that the primary lived experience to use is that the existential experience is of being useless. And watch some of those videos of Hitler emerging in Germany, where you have people building motorways. They were propaganda, obviously, so not the reality. But these were people who are rotting, have lost any place in society. Now they thought they had one. I think that's tremendously dangerous. Then the other point, which was made about polarization and complexity, very, very important point, and generational injustice, Well, in complexity, I think I would see the main application of that now is actually, oddly enough, within MAGA. I mean, there are many different types of liberalism, obviously. MAGA and all the populist movements are internally split on lots of issues. In America, over Epstein, you've got the conspirators saying, you promised to give us all these tapes. Why are you holding them back? So they're very, very suspicious. Come up with mad, deranged theories of all kinds. They're actually split over immigration because the tech brothers want, I think they're called HB1s or something. They want people from highly trained people that they need and might really need actually to build up there. They might really need them because they haven't been producing enough. They've been producing countless lawyers and humanities professors, but not enough engineers and so on. So, but they say, so they're deeply divided. Whereas on the other hand, you have people like Bannon, who, by the way, the more I've tried to find out about it, I think he basically invented Trump. I mean, it was he who gave them the narrative with which he defeated the ancien regime, the liberal ancien regime. It was he who invented that but I think he's a tremendously powerful figure. I doubt he's going to become president, but he could certainly be a kingmaker. And he's adamant about on the immigration issue. He's well to the right of Farage on that, well to the right of someone like Meloni in Italy, and actually to the right of some people in the Conservative Party now, who are proposing ideas of having deportation of people who have been legally here, for decades even. I think that's a completely abhorrent idea and also a very dangerous one. Who decides whether you're contributing to cultural coherence? Well, I don't know. You've been reading this stuff about Omar Khayyam. It's a bit odd. I mean, who does? I think this is a very, and also completely impracticable. So I think future generations, that's very, very important because I remember when Brexit happened and people were saying, this is so hard on the young people. I thought that was a joke then. It's a bigger joke now because actually recruitment to the far right is at its highest among young people. And there are obvious economic reasons for that. If you can't live anywhere, can't find anywhere to live, can't buy a property, unthinkable to save it. And on top of that, you can't even rent somewhere except you're bound to be very, very unhappy. And this is true, I think, right across Europe, most of the European countries. The strongest recruitment is from young males, it has to be said, because there's also a gender difference. Women are more likely to opt for the new Green Party in Britain, for example, but to a type of radical populism. So it's still populism, it's still deep descent, as it were. And it is partly, at least, an economic phenomenon. And what you have to do there, I think, is focus on, as an older person myself, I mean, I think something has to be done about the triple lock on pensions. I mean, that's a lot of money every year, not just a one-off spend. You have to do it, but it's very, very hard to do. And to take an example of how hard it is to do, before Xavier Millet came, I said, what happens, I wrote an article saying, what happens in Argentina would be very interesting from this point of view, because here you have 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the top 3 or 4 countries in the world in terms of wealth, declining for about 60, ruined and re-ruined many times. And they reached such depths of despair, especially among young people, that they vote into this man who gets his policies by communing telepathically with dead dogs. He was a tantric yoga expert, a colorful figure, and very radical libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, and all the rest of it. But they voted him into power, as actually I thought they would, because despair had gotten that far. And yet, the chainsaw cutting back the state, coming up against deep realities. It produces extreme hardship on sections of the population. It excludes them. And yet it's unsustainable. So what happens next? I'll tell you what I think will happen next. Trump will back off probably back off. Not certain, you never know. He'll probably back off from the big bailout he's promising. And Milei has never turned down. He's never exited from his relations with the Chinese. So another victory from the Chinese. So it's very, very difficult to do. But I think that's an example of what you're saying about the generational aspect. If we neglect that, then the game's up, because there's no reason for young people. If they have nothing, if they can look forward to practically nothing in this society, they have no reason to want it to continue. They'll be, and this is where maybe disinformation, you see, I think there's a lot of indigenous disinformation. The indigenous disinformation, well, ban landlords and everything will go well. Well, do this and we'll have 100% wealth tax above a certain relatively low level, usually a little bit higher than the person who says it. What then happens? We know what that happens. We just have to look at the forgotten experience of countries all over the world, not only in the communist countries, when they've been, including Argentina. So thank you for those questions. I learned more from them, I'm sure, than you did from my answers.
I think we probably do have to draw things towards a close, but if I might just pick up and make one or two comments that come to me from listening to what you have said. One of the things it seems to me that emerges from your comments is the need to take seriously people with whom you disagree. And this is something that one of my older psychoanalytic colleagues said to me. He recently written a book, and knowing that psychoanalysts don't generally speak briefly, I decided to tease him, and I said, Ed, you've recently published this book. Can you sum it up in a sentence for me? Fully assuming that he would then start to explain to me why it was very complex and he couldn't, and he didn't. He said, yes, I can. And I thought, I'm all ears. I want to hear this. I said, well, what's the sentence? He says, is this, John? After a lifetime of engaging with people, I've come to the conclusion that when I fundamentally disagree with someone, I have to ask myself the question, what are they right about? Because if they really believe it, then there's something there that I'm not seeing. And I need to try to understand what it is that they're right about. The second thing I think that comes to me is that I think you've been trying to tell us in this great temple of liberalism, not to abandon the whole notion of liberalism, but to ask ourselves the question of whether or not we've gone a little bit astray, and that we need to think again about some of the things we've forgotten or lost. And I suppose as I do that, and I think back to my own experience, you talked about how liberals could become too dependent on regulation and on the law and capturing the courts and legislative authorities and so on. And I've seen that happening. And when I come into political life, the reason I did it was because people were killing each other in my part of the United Kingdom. And I wanted to stop it. And the received wisdom at the time was that if you had certain kinds of political structures and protections for human rights and legislative processes, that would solve the problem. And you could then marginalize these extreme people so extreme that they turn to violence. And it all seemed very reasonable. And the only problem was, it didn't work. We tried it, and we tried it again. I mean, Mick's nodding because he lived through this along with Fiona. Tried it again, and it just didn't work. And then we had to begin, well, how are we going to address this? And there were two things we had to do. First of all, we had to take seriously these people that we really radically disagreed with, the people that said there is no solution in politics other than turning to violence. And we had to engage with those people, which was very difficult. There were ethical questions and practical questions and political questions and so on and so on. But actually, what we came to the conclusion was that the problem was one of disturbed historic relationships between communities of people. And the resolution of that was to address those disturbed relationships and build a different kind of set of relationships. And it was complex because there weren't just relationships between Protestants and Catholics in the North. There were also North-South relations, there were East-West relations. And although everybody accepted the ones in the North were disturbed, people pretended in London and Dublin that there were no disturbed relationships between them. But actually, when they had to face it, there were problems there. And there were the relationships with our friends in the United States and in the rest of Europe and so on. But it was fundamentally about relationships. And one of the things that takes me back to is the approach of someone like William York Gladstone. Because actually he was hugely concerned about people and their relationships. And he went out and did quite bizarre things in a way to try to address people who were living in a disturbed way of life and so on, as he understood it. And the other component of it, which I think you've appealed to us, is to not abandon the business of thinking about things and trying to understand them and engage with them. And I don't know whether many of you have gone to the Gladstone Library, not the one that was upstairs, but the one that is on the other side of the road from Howard and Castle. Because the President of the United States pretty much all have libraries, whether they read anything or not. But we haven't that tradition in Britain, except for Gladstone. And Gladstone had 40,000 books in his library, and we know that he read them, because if you go and look at them, he has made notes in them. Disraeli said this piece of nonsense or whatever, And you go to the back of the book and he has references to all the notes that he made. And so he did not dismiss either the importance of relationships or the importance of thinking. And it feels to me as though you've pointed us tonight to take seriously those people with whom we deeply disagree, to find a way of having a relationship with them, which is not about agreeing with them, but it is about giving them the dignity and respect of disagreeing with them and still finding a way of living together. And as one would expect from such a good and distinguished academic, and the questions have been coming from other academics as well, not to either depend entirely on the intellect, but not to dismiss the importance of understanding and engaging with those questions.
That's the future of liberalism. And we need the future because radical liberalism is a dead end for this country, maybe certainly for this country, a dead end. This is the future of liberalism.
I can't think of a better way of ending with that injunction to all of us. That is the future of liberalism. Please show your appreciation, John.
I decided not to read it.